Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. The Pope. We all love the Pope, right? Successor to St. Peter, head of the Catholic Church, and ruler of Vatican City. But not too long ago, relatively speaking, there was a time when, instead of just ruling over tiny Vatican City, the Pope controlled all of this. But it wasn't until the unification of Italy in the 19th century that the Papal States would be destroyed and the Pope relegated to his minuscule domain. But right before this happened, there was actually a plan for the Pope to take control of all of Italy. So, what if, in an alternate timeline, the Pope had united Italy? So first, let's give a little bit of background on the situation that both Italy and the papacy were in. The year is 1842, and Italy hadn't been united for around 1300 years. Way back in the 500s AD, Emperor Justinian had conquered, or reconquered if you will, Italy for the Eastern Roman Empire. But as time went on, Constantinople's hold over Italy began to weaken, facing invasions from the Lombards and eventually the Franks. And the king of the Franks, Pepin, would end up donating a portion of central Italy directly to the Pope. The idea was that since the Pope is head of the church, if he were also the subject of a temporal ruler, this would limit his ability to act independently and might risk the possibility of the Pope being made a puppet of whoever's in charge of Rome. So in order to remedy this, the Pope was to end up becoming the direct ruler of what would come to be known as the Papal States. About 1,000 years, one Holy Roman Empire, and one French Revolution later, Europe ended up being rampaged by revolutionary France and Napoleon. Now, in that 1,000 years' time, Italy was fractured into a bunch of different states, which largely fell under foreign domination, which the Italians were kinda pissed about. And once the French invaded Italy, they would end up introducing the ideas of liberalism and nationalism. So, combining the frustration against foreign domination with these new ideologies, this would result in the birth of Italian nationalism and a push to reunite the Italian people under one state in order to restore the lost glory of Italy. However, not everyone was on board with this. The pushes for Italian unification were heavily dominated by Freemasons who wanted to use Italian unification as a means to weaken the Catholic Church and secularize Italy. Now, as you can imagine, quite a few Catholics in Italy weren't super thrilled about this, and so began pushing back against ideas of Italian unification. But while the divides between nationalists and traditionalists continued to grow, one Catholic priest from Piedmont had an idea. Vincenzo Gioberti was a prominent liberal Catholic priest and was the chaplain to the King of Sardinia-Piedmont. Gioberti agreed with the nationalists that the Italian people needed to be reunited, but the way he wanted to do this was quite different from the way many other Italian nationalists wanted. Gioberti said that the glory of Italy was in the church and the papacy, as in his mind, the Italian papacy was what had civilized all of Western Europe. He also recognized that Italy was innately Catholic in nature and that the Pope was the most unifying figure in the peninsula. But then again, he also saw that, after 1,000 years of division, the different regions in Italy had grown quite culturally and institutionally different from each other. So his plan was to have Italy united under a loose federation ruled by the Pope. Gioberti collected his ideas and released them in a book in 1842, which spread far and wide across Italy, particularly to one Cardinal Mastai Ferretti, a similarly liberal Catholic cardinal who sympathized with the sentiments of Italian unification and was significantly influenced by Gioberti. And this would become quite important when, 4 years later, in 1846, after the death of Pope Gregory XVI, Cardinal Mastai Ferretti would end up being elected as Pope, taking the name Pope Pius IX. Upon his ascension to the pontificate, Pius IX would immediately begin making numerous liberal reforms in the Papal States, such as reforming agriculture, finance, and trade, allowing for greater freedom of the press, and even giving amnesty to revolutionaries who were being held as political prisoners, as well as opposing Austrian control over northern Italy. And Pius was not only influenced by Gioberti's ideas, but even began taking action to realize them, beginning talks with other monarchs in Italy to discuss federalization, with all of this going to make him immensely popular in Italy. However, in the year 1848, growing liberal sentiments in Europe would explode after a revolution in France toppled King Louis Philippe, ultimately spreading all across the continent, especially to Italy. The Italian populace began pushing back against their monarchs, demanding liberalization lest they be overthrown. And seeing this unfold, Pius IX began to have a change of heart. As he witnessed the liberal revolution spreading all across Europe, Pius began to realize that it was impossible to reconcile the ideas of liberalism with Catholicism. And by making all of these liberal reforms, he had inadvertently made himself a symbol for liberals and revolutionaries against Catholicism. So, after realizing this, Pius quickly backed down from his liberal stances, and when pressed to pass a constitution, the reforms that it made were minimal. Meanwhile, in northern Italy, Lombardy-Venetia broke out in revolt against the Austrians as the many newly revolutionary states in Italy, led by Sardinia-Piedmont, joined the fight against Austria, starting the First Italian War of Independence. However, Pius IX, seeing what a liberal unification of Italy would mean for the Church, and also not seeing a war against Austria as feasible, refused to join the war against Austria. After this, any goodwill he had with the nationalists was destroyed, as revolutionaries, many of whom he himself had released from prison, killed his prime minister before overthrowing the papal government, proclaiming the Roman Republic. Pius fled Rome, but after France retook the city, the Papal States would be restored, with Pius returning, not nearly the same liberal pope he was before the revolutions. After all of this had happened, Pius took a staunchly conservative turn, standing firm against liberalism and solidifying the Holy See and Sardinia-Piedmont as enemies. However, in the end, with victory in another war against Austria and several invasions across Italy, Sardinia-Piedmont would end up proclaiming the Kingdom of Italy, including many territories taken from the Papal States, with only the region of Rome still under papal control. But this wasn't enough for the nationalists, though, who still sought Rome, which was under French protection. But after the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War, France was forced to withdraw troops as Italy invaded, as Rome and the Papal States would fall. And so, Italy was united under a secular, liberal regime, with Pius IX being relegated to, in his own words, a prisoner in the Vatican. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Gioberti's plan had succeeded and Italy was united under the Pope? So, first, how does this even happen? Making a timeline in which this is possible is difficult, but not impossible. And I managed to come up with 3 possibilities. Number 1. Pope Gregory XVI dies earlier, in maybe around 1843, allowing Pius IX more time to make the necessary moves needed to federalize Italy before the revolutions of 1848 happen. Number 2. The revolutions of 1848 never happen, meaning that Pius IX doesn't have the same reason to move away from his liberal positions. And number 3. The revolutions of 1848 still happen, but for whatever reason, Pius never changes his mind about liberalism, despite what was going on. Now, since getting rid of the revolutions of 1848 outright would have way too many side effects, and since Pius not changing his mind despite the revolution still taking place both A, doesn't make any sense, and B, would change too much about his pontificate, we're gonna go with option number 1, being that Pope Gregory XVI dies earlier, giving Pius IX more time to try to federalize Italy. So, after Gregory XVI dies in 1843, Pius IX is elected as Pope 3 years earlier. With the added time, Pius has more time to be a liberal pope, giving him more time to negotiate with the other monarchs in Italy to achieve some form of federalization. Now, it's still very unlikely that this would be able to be accomplished in the 5 years between Pius becoming pope and the 1848 revolutions, but For the sake of the scenario, we're gonna assume that, despite this, negotiations go on without a hitch as the other monarchs in Italy sign a treaty to unite into an Italian federation led by Pope Pius IX. This Italian federation would look very different from the Kingdom of Italy that we saw in our timeline. As per Gioberti's plan, the monarchs in Italy would retain their domains and hold on to their titles. But since this is still a liberal plan, each of the Italian states is still made to introduce some kind of parliament, giving the populace a say in the government. However, despite the decentralization, Italy would still have one united foreign, economic, and trade policy determined by the Pope, who leads the federation. However, the one thing the Pope doesn't control, though, is the military, which would come under the control of the King of Sardinia-Piedmont, due to Sardinia-Piedmont being seen as having the most effective military in Italy. By the time of the 1848 revolutions, though, it's still very likely that Pius changes his mind about liberalism as he attempts to rein in reforms in Italy. But with Italy already being united in a more liberal fashion, Italy doesn't see the same uprisings that they did in our timeline. However, the same can't be said for Lombardy-Venetia, which still rises up against Austria. The nationalists in Italy would once again push for war against Austria, but Pius IX would still refuse, sparking outrage in Italy. But in the spirit of 1848, the nationalists would very likely revolt against Pius IX, overthrowing him and placing King Charles Albert of Sardinia-Piedmont as head of the Federation instead, as he once again invades Austria. However, the Italian nationalists would very likely be defeated once again as France retakes Rome and Pius IX returns and is reinstated as the head of the Italian Federation. But once again, after having been overthrown by Italian nationalists, Pius IX takes a staunch stance against liberalism, clamping down on revolutionaries and centralizing power in Italy into the Holy See, putting Italy under firm Roman control. After this, Pius would very likely pursue close relations with France and Austria, who were his closest allies during the war. And with Italy being united and Austria retaining their Italian lands, Austria and France wouldn't have to compete for dominance over the peninsula, as Pius likely begins working towards an alliance between the three. And without the Second Italian War of Independence humiliating the Austrians, and with close ties being formed between Italy and Austria, it's very unlikely that Otto von Bismarck pushes for a war with Austria, as the Austro-Prussian War never happens. Instead, Bismarck very likely pushes for unification among the North German states, but with an alliance likely being formed between France, Italy, and Austria, it's unlikely that he would be able to incorporate the South German states as they end up joining the emerging Roman alliance instead. And without the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III remains on the French throne. Prussia, meanwhile, feeling isolated, would very likely continue to pursue close relations with Russia, a natural ally, due to their conflicting interests with Austria in the Balkans. The British as well, by the end of the century, seeing the alliances unfolding in Europe, would still feel compelled to join into one of them. And due to Wilhelm II likely still building up the Prussian navy, and Britain's competition with Russia in Asia, they would probably end up joining the Roman alliance. So, as the Balkans continue to break out in revolt and the Ottomans are squeezed out, Austria and Russia once again compete for control over the region, leading to the outbreak of World War I once again. However, in this timeline, such a war would prove unwinnable for the Prussians and Russians as the Roman alliance sees victory. And with this triumph, the papacy grows in its powerful position in Europe, quite a contrast from the prisoner in the Vatican of our world. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also, maybe, subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.